The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody quite knows how to respond to. That particular held breath silence that comes before people decide what version of what they just witnessed they are going to agree on. His hand had moved fast. I had not seen it coming, not because I wasn't paying attention, but because in 11 years of marriage I had never needed to watch for it. The left side of my face was warm. I stood at the head of his mother's dining table, with 14 members of his family around it, and I did not cry and I did not move, and I looked at my husband's face, which had already shifted from anger into something more complicated, a kind of stunned recalibration, the face of a man who had just done something he could not take back, and was only now understanding that. Nobody spoke. His mother looked at her plate. His brother looked at the wall. I reached up and touched my cheek, very lightly, just once. Then I set my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the room at a completely normal pace. The drive home took 22 minutes. I know, because I counted. To understand how I got to that dining room, I need to take you somewhere earlier, somewhere the warning signs were smaller and easier to explain away. If this story is pulling you in, hit subscribe. New stories every week. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country below. My name is Rachel Mercer. I am 40 years old, and I have worked for the past 12 years as a senior HR director at a healthcare company in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is not the city most people picture when they think of the South. It does not have the slow pace or the moss-draped streets of the deeper South. It moves. It builds. The neighborhood where we lived, Dilworth, was one of the older parts of the city, with craftsman bungalows and streets canopied by oaks that had been there longer than the houses beneath them. Our house was a pale yellow bungalow with a wide front porch that I had chosen specifically because it had a porch swing, which I had always wanted and had never, in 11 years of marriage, used as often as I intended to. My work is people. That sounds vague, so let me be more specific. I spend my days navigating the gap between what people say they did and what the documentation shows actually happened. Workplace investigations, conflict mediation, performance records, the kind of work that requires you to hold two contradictory accounts simultaneously and determine, carefully and without emotion, which one the evidence supports. I was good at it. I had always been good at it. What I had not done, until that Sunday evening in his mother's dining room, was apply that same skill to my own marriage. Daniel Mercer was 43, a commercial architect who drew buildings with a precision that people admired and ran his household, with a set of expectations that he rarely named directly. That was the thing about Daniel. He did not make demands loudly. He made them through silence, through the slight cooling of his manner when something displeased him, through the look he gave me across a room that I had learned, over years, to read as a warning. I had become fluent in a language I had never agreed to learn. We had met at a fundraiser for a children's literacy organization, the kind of event where people dress up and feel good about themselves, and sometimes, as a side effect, meet someone interesting. He was interesting. He was precise and attentive, and had a quality of focus when he talked to you that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I had found that quality enormously attractive at 30, and had only gradually understood, over the years, that the same focus could also be a form of control. His family was close, knit in the way that some families are close-knit. Not with warmth exactly, but with density. They occupied each other's lives thoroughly. His mother, Gloria, ran the family gatherings with the organizational precision of a general who had never lost a campaign. His brother Marcus deferred to Daniel in everything. His sister Patrice had never, in 11 years, once asked me a direct question about my own life. They were not unkind people. They were simply a family that had a fixed shape, and I had been expected to fit into it rather than change it. My father was a different matter entirely. Judge Harold Okonkwo had served on the North Carolina Superior Court for 19 years. He was 67 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his word was final. He and my mother had raised me, and my two brothers in Raleigh, in a house where education was treated as an obligation and honesty, as a non-negotiable. My father was not a man who raised his voice. He had never needed to. The quiet certainty he carried was more effective than volume had ever been. Daniel had met my father exactly 6 times in 11 years of marriage. He had found reasons, every time, to keep the visits brief. On the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker, I kept a small leather notebook with a broken clasp, the kind that no longer snapped shut properly and had to be held closed by a rubber band I had wrapped around it years ago. I used it for grocery lists, appointment reminders, the small organizational notes of a household. My mother had given it to me when I started my first real job, and I had replaced the rubber band 3 times, but never the notebook itself. It was just there every morning, ordinary and slightly battered, the way useful things tend to be. That Sunday had started the way most of Gloria's Sundays started, with the particular performative warmth that masked the underlying hierarchy. She hugged me at the door with the embrace she always offered, which was real enough in its way but which also had the quality of something practiced. Daniel had brought wine. Marcus had arrived early. Patrice's children ran through the front room while the adults settled into the living room with drinks and the comfortable circulation of a family that had been doing this for decades. I had made a dish, roasted vegetables with herbs from the garden, something I had brought before, and that Gloria always accepted graciously, without ever quite incorporating into the meal as an equal offering. It sat on the counter near the stove, present but secondary, which was approximately how I felt in that room on most of these Sundays, and which I had always managed by telling myself that the feeling was my own insecurity, rather than an accurate read of the room. The dinner conversation had moved through its usual topics: Gloria's neighbor, Marcus's work, the children's school situations. Daniel had been quieter than usual. That familiar 3-day tightness had not fully lifted, and I could feel it in the way he held his wine glass, and the particular quality of his silences. Then Gloria made her comment about the house, and I had asked what she meant, and Daniel had said not now, and I had pressed, gently, I thought, reasonably, and his hand had moved. The sound of it in that dining room, in that particular silence that followed, was something I still carry with me, not as a wound, but as a reference point. A before and after, the moment the two halves of what my marriage had been, and what it actually was stopped, being 2 separate things in my understanding, and became one clear, undeniable picture. The dinner had been Gloria's idea, a Sunday gathering, the whole family, the kind that happened 4 or 5 times a year, and that I had learned to prepare for the way you prepare for a long flight, with patience, with the right things in your bag, with the understanding that you would be glad when it was over. Daniel had been in a difficult mood for 3 days before the dinner. A project at work had hit delays. A client had complained. He had come home those evenings and moved through the house with the specific tightness that told me to stay out of his way, which I had done, because I had learned that staying out of his way was more effective than engaging with the tightness directly. At the dinner table, the conversation had been ordinary for the first hour. Gloria's cooking, Marcus's new car, Patrice's children. The family moved through their topics with the comfortable efficiency of people who had covered the same ground many times. Then Gloria made a comment about the house. Our house, she said, and this is the exact wording, because I have replayed it enough times to be certain. She said it would be a shame if a house like that ended up going to outside hands. I did not know what she meant, I asked. Daniel looked at me across the table with an expression I had seen before. The look that meant I had said the wrong thing, that the wrong thing was my fault, that I should have known, he said, very quietly. Not now, Rachel. I said, I just wanted to understand what Gloria meant. And then his hand moved. The sound was sharp. The room went silent. I stood there with the warmth spreading across my left cheek, and 14 people carefully not looking at me. And I understood something with a clarity that had no emotion in it at all. Just pure, cold information. This had been building for 11 years. I had simply not let myself see the direction it was moving. I set my napkin down. I pushed my chair back. I walked out. In the car, I did not cry. I drove the 22 minutes home, parked in the driveway, went inside, and sat at the kitchen counter with my hands flat on the surface. The leather notebook was right there. Rubber band still around it, exactly where I had left it that morning. I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. My father came to Charlotte on the 6th day. He did not make an occasion of it. He drove up on a Wednesday afternoon, and we sat in my kitchen, and he drank coffee, and I showed him the documents, and he went through them the way he went through everything, methodically, without reacting, until he had the full picture. When he finished, he did not say anything immediately. He picked up his coffee cup, which was empty by then, and turned it slowly in his hands. Then he said, "Tell me about the Asheville property." I told him what I knew. The address, the purchase date, the title in Daniel's name only, the traceable connection to our joint account. He nodded. He set the cup down. He said, "He was building an exit." It was not a question. I said, "I thought so." My father looked at me across the kitchen table, with the expression he had used my entire life, when he wanted me to understand something important, and was deciding how to say it. He said, "Rachel, a man who builds a secret exit is not a man who stumbled into bad behavior. He is a man who has been planning. Planning requires time. Time means this has been happening for longer than you know." He was right. I knew he was right. He said, "The question is not what happened. You already know what happened. The question is what you want the record to show." That framing, the record, came from 40 years of legal thinking, and it was exactly right. What I wanted was not revenge, not vindication, not even full understanding of everything Daniel had been doing. What I wanted was an accurate record. The facts, documented, unambiguous, in a form that a court could read, and that would say clearly and permanently what had been built in secret during the years I had been trying to hold something together that had never been what I thought it was. I wanted the record to show the truth. My father finished his coffee and drove back to Raleigh that evening. And I sat in the kitchen with the leather notebook open in front of me, every page covered now, the rubber band holding the whole thing together when the broken clasp could not. And I felt, for the first time since Sunday, something that was not quite calm but was adjacent to it. The particular steadiness of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. My father answered on the second ring, the way he always answered, immediately, without preamble, as though he had been expecting the call. I told him what had happened. I said it plainly, the way he had always taught me to say difficult things, without performance, without embellishment, just the facts in the order they occurred. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last. Then he said, "Are you safe right now?" I told him I was home. He said, "Good. Don't make any decisions tonight. Tomorrow we talk." I did not sleep much, not because I was afraid Daniel had not come home, but because my mind was doing the thing it does at work when a case opens up, cataloging, organizing, pulling up every piece of information I had filed away over 11 years and looking at it in a different light. The next morning I called my closest colleague, a woman named Priya, who had worked beside me for 8 years and who had the quality I valued most in another person, which was that she said true things without wrapping them in anything softer than the truth required. She came over that afternoon. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened while I laid out 11 years in the same organized way I would present a workplace investigation to senior leadership. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and then said, "Rachel, you've been managing him the way you manage a difficult employee. You've been de-escalating and documenting and adjusting your behavior to prevent incidents. That's not a marriage. That's a coping strategy." That sentence rearranged something. Not because it was new information, somewhere underneath everything. I had known it, but because having it named plainly by someone I trusted removed the last layer of softness I had been wrapping it in. She was right. I had been coping. I had been so good at coping that I had mistaken coping for living. Over the following 9 days, I did what I knew how to do. I went through every document I had access to that was relevant to my marriage, my household, and my finances. I did this with the same methodical attention I brought to workplace investigations. Not emotionally, not reactively, just systematically. The joint bank account first, 12 years of statements. which I had access to through our online banking, and which I had never examined with investigative attention, because I had trusted what I was told. What I found, working backward through 2 years of history, was a pattern of cash withdrawals, irregular in amount, regular in timing, that corresponded with periods when Daniel had told me money was tight, and we needed to be careful about spending. I noted the amounts, the dates, and the total. I did not react to the total. I wrote it down in the leather notebook. Rubber band removed now so the pages could lie flat. The broken clasp no longer relevant because I was not closing it between sessions. I was keeping it open, working in it constantly. The property records came next. Our house was in both names. I knew that. What I had not examined carefully was the refinancing we had done 3 years ago. Daniel had handled the paperwork, and I had signed where he told me to sign, which was a thing I would not do again, but which at the time had seemed like a reasonable division of labor. Going through the documents now, I found a life insurance policy I had not known existed, taken out in my name as the insured, with the beneficiary listed as a company I did not recognize. I photographed every page. My father called every evening. He did not tell me what to do. He asked questions, specific, careful. The questions of a man who understood exactly what kind of case was being built. On the 4th evening, he asked if I had spoken to an attorney. I told him I was going to. He said, good. He said, take someone with you who knows what to look at. The HR investigator's instinct kicks in before the emotion does. That is the thing about doing the work for long enough. It becomes a default mode, a way of processing that runs underneath whatever else is happening. While part of me was simply a woman sitting at her kitchen counter after something significant had occurred, another part was already cataloging, already organizing the information into categories and timelines. I had been doing that my whole marriage. I understood that now. The difference was that I had been cataloging the information to manage it, to predict Daniel's moods, to preempt his reactions, to keep the temperature of our house at a level that would prevent incidents. I had been an investigator in service of the status quo, rather than in service of the truth. That night, I turned it around. I started with what I had noticed and dismissed over 11 years. The cash withdrawals I had seen on statements and accepted without question. The business trips that had seemed slightly more frequent in the past 2 years than they had been before. The way Daniel handled all the financial paperwork and presented me with things to sign at a pace that did not leave much room for careful reading. The Asheville mention, casual, once, about a year ago, that he had described as a client site visit, and which I had filed away and never returned to. None of these things had seemed significant individually. That was the nature of them. They were designed to seem ordinary. What I had never done was put them in sequence on a timeline and look at the shape they made together. The shape they made was not ordinary. Priya had said the true thing at the kitchen table, but she had said another true thing earlier in our conversation that I had not quoted because I was still sitting with it. She had said that the people who are best at managing conflict are often the last to recognize when the conflict has moved past managing. I had been managing. I had been so focused on keeping things functional that I had not let myself see what the function was actually serving. Over those 9 days, I built the full picture, not just the financial records, though those were central, but the pattern of the whole 11 years, the way Daniel's control had been total without ever being explicit, the way every decision had eventually deferred to his preferences while appearing to be collaborative, the way I had slowly, over more than a decade, become someone who checked her own reactions before having them, who edited her speech before speaking, who arranged her schedule around his mood. I wrote all of it down, not as an emotional document, as an evidentiary one, dates and behaviors and documented instances. The same structure I would use for a workplace investigation report. When I was done, I read it through once. Then I put the notebook down on the kitchen counter and made a cup of tea and stood at the window looking at the Dilworth Street in the dark. And I thought about the woman who had sat on the porch swing exactly 0 times in 11 years of owning a house with one. And I thought about what that said about what those 11 years had actually cost. There was something else I needed to understand before I was ready to close the file. The timeline. Not just what Daniel had done, but when. The Asheville property had been purchased 18 months ago, which meant the planning had begun at a minimum 18 months ago. And likely earlier, the planning for a property purchase precedes the purchase itself by weeks or months of searching, financing, negotiating. He had been in the early stages of building his exit, at the very least, for 2 years. 2 years ago, I had been going to Gloria's Sunday dinners and managing his moods and making grocery lists in a notebook with a broken clasp and telling myself that the friction in our marriage was normal, manageable, something that long marriages accumulated and worked through. He had been building his exit. That particular piece of information did not make me angry in the moment I understood it fully. What it did was clarify. It removed the last remaining ambiguity about what the 11 years had actually been. Not a marriage that had grown difficult, but a structure that had been useful to Daniel for a specific period, and which he had been quietly preparing to leave when it was no longer useful. I had been living inside someone else's calculation, and calling it a life. One more thing I confirmed in those 9 days, which I have not mentioned yet, because it came last, and because it is the detail that makes the whole picture complete. I pulled the visitor logs from the Asheville Properties HOA, available through a public records request that my professional background made routine, and cross-referenced the dates with Daniel's claimed work travel over the previous 18 months. 12 of his overnight trips, documented in our shared calendar as client visits, had taken place within 20 miles of that property. He had not been working late. He had been building something. I wrote the date of each trip in the notebook, beside the corresponding calendar entry, and drew a line between them. 12 lines. A pattern so clear it required no interpretation. I closed the notebook. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the street. And then I went to bed and slept better than I had in 3 days. Before I tell you what I found next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? I'm always surprised how far these stories travel. What I found next was the thing that changed the shape of everything I had been looking at. Going through Daniel's home office, which I had always respected as his space, and which he had never invited me into, I found a folder in the filing cabinet's bottom drawer, behind a row of architectural project files, containing correspondence I was not supposed to see. Letters from an attorney I did not know. Documents referencing a property in Asheville. A property I had no knowledge of, purchased 18 months ago, titled in Daniel's name only. Bank statements from an account I had not known existed, showing regular transfers in amounts that matched the cash withdrawals I had identified from our joint account. The money from our joint account had been going to fund a separate life, not a dramatic secret life. Just a property, quietly purchased, carefully hidden. The kind of thing you acquire when you are planning for a future that does not include your current marriage. He had been planning to leave, or he had been preparing for the possibility. Either way, he had been building an exit, while I was at the kitchen counter, making grocery lists in a notebook, with a broken clasp. I sat in his office chair for a long time. The filing cabinet drawer was still open beside me. Through the window, the Dilworth Street was doing its ordinary afternoon things. A dog walker, a cyclist, someone carrying takeout bags up to their front door. I picked up the leather notebook. The pages were dense now, covered in my own handwriting. Amounts, dates, account numbers, property addresses, policy numbers, the full documented record of a marriage that had been operating in 2 registers simultaneously. I called my father. He picked up immediately. I said, "I have everything," he said. "Then come home this weekend." I went. I sat at the dining table in my parents' Raleigh house, the table where I had done homework and argued about curfews and learned what a family that operated honestly actually felt like. And I spread the documents out in front of my father and my mother, and my father put on his reading glasses and went through every page the same way he went through case files, carefully and completely. And when he finished, he took his glasses off and set them on the table and looked at me. He said, "You did good work." Coming from Harold Okonkwo, those 3 words were the equivalent of an ovation. Sandra Park's office had the particular quality of competence that shows up in the details. The organized shelves, the files that were accessible rather than decorative, the absence of anything in the space that did not have a clear purpose. She was in her mid-40s, precise in her movements, and had the quality I most valued in any professional, which was that she did not make you feel that your problem was either surprising or insurmountable. She asked good questions, not about feelings, about facts, dates, amounts, document sources, chain of custody for the materials I had gathered. She took notes in a shorthand I could not read from across the desk, and occasionally asked me to repeat something so she could be certain she had it correctly. When she had gone through everything, she said, "The undisclosed asset is the strongest piece. Everything else, the cash withdrawals, the separate account, the insurance policy, those add texture and support the pattern. But a property purchased with marital funds and hidden from a spouse is actionable on its own." She asked about my father, not because she needed him. The case was solid without him. But she had looked at my intake form and seen the employment information I had listed for next of kin. And she was someone who liked to understand the complete picture. I told her who he was. She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I could not quite read. Then she said, "Does your husband know?" I told her he had met my father 6 times and had never asked him a single meaningful question. She made a small note. Then she said, "File Thursday. Motion for asset freeze on the Asheville property included. Before he has any reason to expect it." I drove home through Charlotte's afternoon traffic, feeling something I had not felt in 11 years of managing and adjusting and keeping the temperature right. I felt like myself, fully, specifically, entirely myself, without the layer of calculation that had been running underneath everything for so long I had stopped noticing it was there. At home, the leather notebook was on the counter where I had left it. I looked at it differently now than I had 9 days ago, when I had first opened it to a blank page and started writing down what I knew. It had started as a grocery list notebook. It had become something else entirely, a record, evidence. The documented shape of what I had found when I finally started looking. I did not open it that evening. I just let it sit there on the counter, closed and complete, while I made dinner for the first time in weeks, without listening for the sound of a car in the driveway. The attorney my father recommended was a woman named Sandra Park, who practiced family law in Charlotte and whom my father had encountered professionally on 2 occasions, and described as someone who did not waste anyone's time, including her own. Her office was in a building in uptown Charlotte. Clean, direct, the kind of space that communicated competence without trying to impress you. She shook my hand when I came in, indicated the chair across from her desk, and looked at the organized folder I placed in front of her, with an expression that suggested she appreciated organization. She read through everything, without asking questions, until she had finished. Then she set the folder down and said, "The undisclosed property is the central piece. Hidden asset during a marriage. Purchased with funds traceable to the joint account. That's material." I told her I had the bank statement showing the transfers. She said, "Good. The life insurance policy in your name with an unknown beneficiary is a secondary issue, worth investigating. The pattern of cash withdrawals is relevant to asset discovery." She looked at me directly. "How long have you been collecting this?" 9 days, I told her. She nodded once, with an expression I recognized from my own professional life. The specific acknowledgement of someone who understood what 9 days of methodical work actually represented. She filed for divorce the following Thursday. The motion included a request for full financial disclosure and an immediate freeze on any transfer of the Asheville property. It was filed before Daniel had any reason to expect paperwork, which was how Sandra had intended it. Daniel called me that evening, after he was served. I did not answer. I stood in the kitchen looking at the phone while it rang 3 times. 4. And then I looked at the leather notebook on the counter beside me, lying open to the last page of notes I had made, the broken clasp hanging loose at the side, and I thought about 11 years of adjusting my behavior to manage another person's moods. I let it go to voicemail. I did not listen to the message until the next morning, when Sandra was available if I needed to call her afterward. The Mecklenburg County Courthouse was a building I had driven past dozens of times, without ever having occasion to enter. It had the institutional solidity of civic architecture, stone and glass, deliberate, built to communicate permanence. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the car until Sandra texted that she was inside. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pale wood, fluorescent lighting, a gallery with perhaps 15 seats. My father was already there when I arrived. He had come early, as he always did. Daniel saw him before the proceedings began. He turned to look at the gallery and found my father's eyes. Harold Okonkwo did not nod or acknowledge him in any way. He simply sat with his hands folded, expression completely neutral, and let Daniel understand what his presence meant. Daniel turned back around. His neck had gone slightly red above his collar. Garrett leaned toward him and said something quietly, and Daniel shook his head. Sandra presented the documents in sequence. She was efficient and unhurried, the way good attorneys are when the evidence does the work. The account statements, the property records, the fund tracing, the insurance policy, each item placed before the judge with a brief explanation of its relevance. Nothing more dramatic than that. The judge, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses, and the manner of someone who had heard many versions of many stories, and was interested only in the documented version, went through each document carefully. She asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them directed at Sandra. All of them answered with specific references to the materials in front of her. Garrett's reframing attempts were brief and unconvincing. He tried twice. The second attempt produced a look from the judge that did not require words. Daniel said my name at one point. Just that, Rachel, in the tone he had always used when he wanted to redirect my attention. I looked at him. I did not say anything. His expression shifted through several things in rapid succession. A version of the recalibration I had seen in his mother's dining room, but slower this time, and with the specific quality of someone who is understanding. Finally, that the audience for this moment was not going to behave the way he had assumed. My father was in that gallery, not speaking, not intervening, not doing anything, except being there. But Harold Okonkwo had spent 19 years on a superior court bench, and he understood better than most that presence itself is a form of testimony. The hearing concluded with the asset freeze granted and full financial disclosure ordered within 30 days. Sandra gathered her materials with the calm efficiency of someone for whom this outcome had been the expected one. I sat for a moment after the judge left the bench, looking at the leather notebook I had carried in my bag. Not needed today, not opened, just present, and thought about the Sunday evening when I had sat at my kitchen counter and looked at it and understood that it was time to start writing things down. Some notebooks stay grocery lists forever. Some change what they are for. The financial disclosure hearing took place in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning in March. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett, who wore a good suit and had the slightly fixed expression of someone who had been briefed on the case and was managing his own reaction to the briefing. Daniel looked different than he had at his mother's dinner table, smaller, somehow, or perhaps just more accurate. The size he had always occupied in my life had come partly from my own perception of him, and my perception had changed. My father was in the gallery. He had driven up from Raleigh the evening before and stayed with my parents' friends in Myers Park. He was not there in any official capacity. He was there as my father, which was a different thing entirely, and which Daniel did not know until he turned around before the proceedings began and saw him sitting 3 rows back in the gallery with his hands folded and his expression entirely neutral. Daniel's face went through something specific when he saw my father. I was watching. He had met Harold Okonkwo 6 times, and he had always treated those meetings as minor obligations, something to get through rather than invest in. He had not, apparently, ever considered what it might mean that his wife's father was a sitting superior court judge with 19 years on the bench and a professional network that covered the entire state. The expression on his face told me he was considering it now. Sandra presented the documentation in sequence. The joint account statements with the cash withdrawals highlighted, the Asheville property records, obtained through the county recorder, the tracing of funds from our joint account to the separate account to the property purchase, the life insurance policy, which Sandra's investigation had connected to a beneficiary account in the name of a woman I did not know, and whose connection to my husband I did not need to know in detail to understand in outline. Each document was placed on the table in front of the judge, with the same quiet efficiency. No drama, no speeches, just the record, in order, saying what it said. Garrett attempted, twice, to reframe the Asheville property as a business investment that Daniel had intended to disclose. Sandra addressed both attempts briefly and continued. Daniel said, at one point, quietly enough, that only his attorney and I could hear. Rachel, we can work this out. I looked at him. I said, no. One word. The judge did not look up from the documents in front of her. But Garrett placed a hand briefly on Daniel's arm, which told me the one word had landed exactly where it needed to. The leather notebook was in my bag beneath the counsel table. Not needed today. Sandra had the originals of everything, but present the way certain things are present. Not because they are useful, but because they are yours. I had carried it here as the thing it actually was now. A complete record of what I had noticed. And when. The months that followed had the particular quality of recalibration. Not dramatic, just gradual. Like a room being slowly returned to its natural temperature after something cold has been removed from it. Sandra finalized the divorce in late summer. The settlement was thorough. The Asheville property was treated as a marital asset. Its value added to the total calculation. The diverted funds were accounted for. Daniel's separate account was fully disclosed and factored in. The life insurance policy was revised with a beneficiary I actually knew. Sandra called it a clean outcome, by which she meant one that was fair and complete, and left nothing unresolved that could come back later. Daniel moved to Asheville, which made a certain kind of sense. He had built something there. He might as well live in it. His brother Marcus reached out about 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. A text, short and genuine. I'm sorry, Rachel. I didn't know about any of it. I believed him without reservation. Marcus had always been peripheral to Daniel's decisions, present at the edges without being part of the planning. I texted back that I appreciated him saying so, and meant it. Gloria called once. She said she was sorry for what happened at her table. She did not specify which part of what happened she meant, and I did not press for clarification. People offer what they are capable of offering, and receiving it gracefully does not require it to be more than it is. Priya came over the Saturday after the settlement was signed. She brought food, too much of it, which was her way of expressing things she would rather not express directly. We ate on the porch swing, both of us, for the first time, which required some logistical adjustment because the swing was designed for one person sitting comfortably, or two sitting close, and we were not people who sat particularly close. But we managed. She said, you know what's funny? He thought the slap was the mistake. He thought if he could walk that back, everything else would hold. I thought about that. She was right. He had understood the slap as the error, the visible thing, the thing that had moved events forward. He had not understood that the events had been moving long before Sunday. He had not understood what 11 years of careful observation accumulates into, when the observer finally decides to look at what she has been seeing. I replanted the front garden in September. I had been meaning to do it for 3 years, and had always found reasons not to. The time, the energy, Daniel's opinion about what the garden should look like. I bought plants I liked without consulting anyone, and spent a Saturday in the dirt. And when I was done, the front of the pale yellow house looked the way I had always imagined it could look, which was not dramatic, just right. The porch swing moved in the September afternoon air. The street was quiet. My tea went cold, and I did not rush to fix it. The divorce was finalized 5 months after Sandra filed. The hidden Asheville property was classified as a marital asset and divided accordingly. The funds traceable from the joint account to its purchase were treated as marital funds that had been diverted, which affected the overall settlement calculation in ways that Sandra had anticipated from the beginning. Daniel's separate account was subject to full disclosure under the court order, and what it disclosed was not entirely surprising. Money that had been quietly accumulated over years in preparation for a life that did not include me. He moved out of the Dilworth house in April. 2 trips to a rented truck, his brother Marcus helping without speaking much. I was not at the house when it happened. I had gone to spend the day with a friend in Concord, not because I was avoiding the moment, but because I did not think I needed to witness it. My father called that afternoon. He did not say much. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was. He said he was proud of me, which he said rarely enough that it meant something specific when he said it. Gloria called once, about 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Her voice was different than I had ever heard it. Uncertain, in a way that Gloria Mercer was almost never uncertain. She said she was sorry for what had happened at her dinner table. She did not specify which part she was sorry for, the slap or the silence that followed it, or the years of family dinners where the shape of things had been allowed to become what it became. I thanked her for calling. I accepted what she offered without requiring it to be more than it was. Marcus sent a text, 2 sentences. I didn't know about any of it. I'm sorry. I believed him. Marcus had always been peripheral to Daniel's decisions, present, but not complicit. And I had no reason to extend to him what I felt toward his brother. I had the porch swing repaired in May. It had needed attention for 2 years. A loose board, a chain that sat wrong. And I had been meaning to get to it, and had always found a reason not to. A neighbor's son who did handyman work came on a Saturday and fixed it in an hour. And that evening, I sat on it for the first time and watched the Dilworth Street go through its early summer evening routines and drank a cup of tea that went cold before I finished it. It was a very ordinary hour. It was the most peaceful hour I had experienced in longer than I could clearly trace. I thought about Priya's words at the kitchen table. That coping strategy sentence that had rearranged something. She had been right. I had been so efficient at managing the conditions of my own life that I had not noticed I was the one being managed. That clarity was not comfortable, but it was clean. Clean was enough. The November morning my father called. I had been up since 6 working on a workplace investigation report that was due Monday, the kind of case I did often, a conflict between 2 employees, documented incidents, the careful reconstruction of what had actually happened versus what each party believed had happened. Routine work, the kind that required the same methodical attention as everything else, but that had, in the months since the divorce, felt different to me in a way I had not quite been able to articulate. I thought about it while we talked. My father and I, our Saturday morning call going through its usual rhythm. After we hung up and I sat with the coffee and the November light, I understood what the difference was. Before, I had been good at investigating other people's situations while being selectively blind to my own. I had known, professionally, exactly how to read the gap between what someone said and what the documentation showed. And I had applied that skill everywhere except the one place it most needed to be applied. That was over. Not because I had become cynical or suspicious of everything, but because I had learned what I had always known in theory, that the people who are closest to us are not exempt from what the evidence says about them. They are just harder to look at clearly. The leather notebook was on the table beside the swing. I had started a new one 3 months ago. The old one had filled up completely, every page covered, and I had filed it in the cabinet in my home office, under a tab I had labeled closed. The new one was already half full of the ordinary running notes of a life. Grocery lists, work reminders, things I wanted to remember, a neighbor's plant recommendation. A book my mother had mentioned. I picked it up. The clasp on this one worked perfectly, snapped shut cleanly, the way things do when they are new. I opened it to the grocery list I had made that morning and added 2 things I had forgotten. Then I set it down and looked at the November street. My father had said he was proud of me, which he did not say often. What I understood now, 8 months out from a dining room in someone else's house, was that the pride was not about the outcome, the documents, the settlement, the clean legal resolution. It was about the decision to look, to finally turn the skill I had always had toward the thing that most needed it. That was the decision. Everything else had followed from it, the way things follow when you finally point yourself in the right direction. 8 months after the hearing, on a Saturday morning in November, I was on the porch swing with coffee when my phone rang. It was my father. He called most Saturday mornings, which was a habit we had developed in the past year, and which I had come to value more than I knew how to say directly. We talked about nothing in particular, a case he had read about, a book my mother was insisting he read, whether I had gotten around to planting the bulbs in the front garden. Ordinary conversation. At the end, he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I asked. "What?" he said. that he sat across from me 6 times and never once asked me a real question. Not about the law. Not about my work. Nothing. He wasn't curious about who you came from. I thought about that after we hung up. The coffee was still warm. The November light was doing what November light does in Charlotte, thin and slightly golden, making the neighborhood look like it was posing for something. The leather notebook was on the small table beside the swing. I had been using it that morning to make a list of things I needed to do before winter properly arrived. Garden tasks, a gutter that needed cleaning, the usual seasonal accounting of a house. The broken clasp had finally given out completely the previous month, and I had replaced the rubber band with a thin leather cord I had found in a kitchen drawer. It was still the same notebook. It just held itself together differently now. I picked it up and looked at it for a moment. My father had been right about everything without saying much. That was the thing about Harold Okonkwo. He did not need to say much because what he said was always accurate. And accurate things did not need repetition to be true. The porch swing moved slightly in the November air. The street was quiet. A cardinal landed briefly on the porch railing, looked at me, and left. Some things change shape without changing their nature. The notebook was still the same notebook. I was still the same person. What had changed was the use I was putting both of us to. Here is what I keep returning to, even now. When someone raises a hand against you in front of witnesses, and every person in that room looks away, what does that silence cost them? And what does it say about what they believed you would do next? He did not know my father was a judge, but more than that, he had spent 11 years with a woman he thought he understood, and had never once been curious enough to look beneath the surface of. The quietest thing I did was also the most permanent. I went home. I opened a notebook. I started writing down what I knew. He raised his hand against the wrong woman. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. And subscribe for more stories like this one.